Gorgias by Plato, translated by Donald J. Zeal. Part 1. Gorgias.
This, they say, is how you're supposed to do your part in a war or a battle, Socrates. Oh, did we arrive when the feast was over, as the saying goes? Are we late? Yes, and a very urbane one it was. Gorgias gave us an admirable, varied presentation just a short while ago. But that's Chaerephon's fault, Callicles. He kept us loitering about in the marketplace. That's no problem, Socrates. I'll make up for it, too. Gorgias is a friend of mine, so he'll give us a presentation, now if you see fit, or else some other time if you like. What's this, Chaerephon? Is Socrates eager to hear Gorgias? Yes, that's the very thing we're here for. Well then, come to my house any time you like. Gorgias is staying with me and will give you a presentation there. Very good, Callicles. But would he be willing to have a discussion with us? I'd like to find out from the man what his craft can accomplish, and what it is that he both makes claims about and teaches. As for the other thing, the presentation, let him put that on another time, as you suggest. There's nothing like asking him, Socrates. This was, in fact, one part of his presentation. Just now he invited those inside to ask him any question they liked, and he said that he'd answer them all. An excellent idea. Ask him, Chaerephon. Ask him what? What he is. What do you mean? Well, if he were a maker of shoes, he'd answer that he was a cobbler, wouldn't he? Or don't you see what I mean? I do. I'll ask him. Tell me, Gorgias, is Callicles right in saying that you made claims about answering any question anyone might put to you? He is, Chaerephon. In fact, I just now made that very claim, and I say that no one has asked me anything new in many a year. In that case, I'm sure you'll answer this one quite easily, Gorgias. Here's your chance to try me, Chaerephon. By Zeus, Chaerephon, try me if you like. I think Gorgias is quite worn out. He's only just now finished a long discourse. Really, Polus, do you think you'd give more admirable answers than Gorgias? What does it matter, as long as they're good enough for you? Nothing at all. You answer us then, since that's what you want. Ask your questions. I will. Suppose that Gorgias were an expert in his brother Herodicus's craft. What would be the right name for us to call him by then? Isn't it the same one as his brother's? Yes, it is. So we'd be right in saying that he's a doctor. Yes. And if he were experienced in the craft of Aristophon, the son of Aglaophon, or his brother, what would be the correct thing to call him? A painter, obviously. Now then, since he's an expert in a craft, what is it, and what would be the most correct thing to call him? Many among men are the crafts devised by experience, Chaerephon, the results of experience. Yes, it is experience that causes our age to march along the way of craft, whereas inexperience causes it to march along the way of chance. Of these various crafts, various men partake in various ways, the best men partaking of the best of them. Our Gorgias is indeed in this group. He partakes of the most admirable of the crafts. Polus certainly appears to have prepared himself admirably for giving speeches, Gorgias, but he's not doing what he promised Chaerephon. How exactly isn't he, Socrates? He hardly seems to me to be answering the question. Why don't you question him then, if you like? No, I won't, not as long as you yourself may want to answer. I'd much rather ask you. It's clear to me, especially from what he has said, that Polus has devoted himself more to what is called oratory than to discussing. Why do you say that, Socrates? Because, Polus, when Chaerephon asked you what craft Gorgias is an expert in, you sing its praises as though someone were discrediting it, but you haven't answered what it is. Didn't I answer that it was the most admirable one? Very much so. No one, however, asked you what Gorgias's craft is like, but what craft it is, and what one ought to call Gorgias. So, just as when Chaerephon put his earlier questions to you, and you answered him in such an admirably brief way, tell us now, in that way too, what his craft is, and what we're supposed to call Gorgias. Or rather, Gorgias, why don't you tell us yourself what the craft you're an expert in is, and hence what we're supposed to call you? It's oratory, Socrates. So we're supposed to call you an orator? Yes, and a good one, Socrates, if you really want to call me what I boast myself to be, as Homer puts it. Of course I do. Call me that, then. Aren't we to say that you're capable of making others orators, too? That's exactly the claim I make, not only here, but elsewhere too. Well now, Gorgias, would you be willing to complete the discussion in the way we're having it right now, that of alternately asking questions and answering them, and to put aside for another time this long style of speech-making like the one Polus began with? Please don't go back on your promise, but we're willing to give a brief answer to what you're asked. There are some answers, Socrates, that must be given by way of long speeches. Even so, I'll try to be as brief as possible. This, too, in fact, is one of my claims. There's no one who can say the same things more briefly than I. That's what we need, Gorgias. Do give me a presentation of this very thing, the short style of speech, and leave the long style for some other time. Very well, I'll do that. You'll say you've never heard anyone make shorter speeches. Come then, you claim to be an expert in the craft of oratory, and to be able to make someone else an orator too. With which of the things there are is oratory concerned? Weaving, for example, is concerned with the production of clothing, isn't it? Yes. And so too music is concerned with the composition of tunes. Yes. By Hera, Gorgias, I do like your answers. They couldn't be shorter. Yes, Socrates, I dare say I'm doing it quite nicely. And so you are. Come and answer me then that way about oratory too. About which of the things there are is it expertise? About speeches. Well, what sort of speeches, Gorgias? Those that explain how sick people should be treated to get well? No. So oratory isn't concerned with all speeches. Oh, no. But it does make people capable of speaking. Yes. And also should be wise in what they're speaking about? Of course. Now, does the medical craft, the one we were talking about just now, make people able both to have wisdom about it and to speak about the sick? Necessarily. This craft, then, is evidently concerned with speeches, too. Yes. Speeches about diseases, that is. Exactly. Isn't physical training also concerned with speeches? Speeches about good and bad physical condition? Yes, it is. In fact, Gorgias, the same is true of the other crafts, too. Each of them is concerned with those speeches that are about the object of the particular craft. Apparently. Then why don't you call the other crafts oratory, since you call any craft whatever that's concerned with speeches oratory? They're concerned with speeches, too. The reason, Socrates, is that in the case of the other crafts, the expertise consists almost completely in working with your hands and activities of that sort. In the case of oratory, on the other hand, there isn't any such manual work. Its activity and influence depend entirely on speeches. That's the reason I consider the craft of oratory to be concerned with speeches, and I say that I'm right about this. I'm not sure I understand what sort of craft you want to call it. I'll soon know more clearly. Tell me this. There are crafts at our disposal, aren't there? Yes. Of all the crafts there are, I take it that there are those that consist for the most part of making things and that call for little speech, and some that call for none at all, ones whose tasks could be done even silently. Take painting, for instance, or sculpture, or many others. When you say that oratory has nothing to do with other crafts, it's crafts of this sort I think you're referring to, or aren't you? Yes, Socrates, you take my meaning very well. And then there are other crafts, the ones that perform their whole task by means of speeches, and that call for practically no physical work besides, or very little of it. Take arithmetic, or computation, or geometry, even checkers and many other crafts. Some of these involve speeches to just about the same degree as they do activity, while others involve speeches more. All their activity and influence depend entirely on speeches. I think you mean that oratory is a craft of this sort. True. But you certainly don't want to call any of these crafts oratory, do you? Even though, as you phrase it, oratory is the craft that exercises its influence through speech. Somebody might take you up, if he wanted to make a fuss and argument, and say, "So you're saying that arithmetic is oratory, are you, Gorgias?" I'm sure, however, that you're not saying that either arithmetic or geometry is oratory. Yes, you're quite right, Socrates. You take my meaning rightly. Come on, then. Please complete your answer in the terms of my question. Since oratory is one of those crafts which mostly uses speeches, and since there are also others of that sort, try to say what it is that oratory, which exercises its influence through speeches, is about. Imagine someone asking me about any of the crafts I mentioned just now. Socrates, what is the craft of arithmetic? I'd tell him, just as you told me, that it's one of those that exercises their influence by means of speech. And if he continued, "What are the crafts about?" I'd say that they're about even and odd, however many of each there might be. If he then asked, "What is the craft you call computation?" I'd say that this one, too, is one of those that exercise their influence entirely by speech. And if he then continued, "What is it about?" I'd answer in the style of those who draw up motions in the assembly that in other respects computation is like arithmetic, for it's about the same thing, even and odd, yet it differs from arithmetic insofar as computation examines the quantity of odd and even, both in relation to themselves and in relation to each other. And if someone asked about astronomy, and I replied that it too exercises its influence by means of speech, then if he asked, "What are the speeches of astronomy about, Socrates?" I'd say that they're about the motions of the stars, the sun and the moon, and their relative velocities. And you'd be quite right to say so, Socrates. Come, Gorgias, you take your turn, for oratory is in fact one of those crafts that carry out and exercise their influence entirely by speech, isn't it? That's right. Tell us then, what are the crafts about? Of the things there are, which is the one that these speeches used by oratory are concerned with? The greatest of human concerns, Socrates, and the best. But that statement, too, is debatable, Gorgias. It isn't at all clear yet, either. I'm sure that you've heard people at drinking parties singing that song in which they count out as they sing that to enjoy good health is the best thing, second is to have turned out good-looking, and third, so the writer of the song puts it, is to be honestly rich. Yes, I've heard it. Why do you mention it? Suppose that the producers of the things the songwriter praised were here with you right now, a doctor, a physical trainer, and a financial expert. Suppose that first the doctor said, "Socrates, Gorgias is telling you a lie. It isn't his craft that is concerned with the greatest good for mankind, but mine." If I then asked him, "What are you to say that?" I suppose he'd say he's a doctor. "What's this you're saying? Is the product of your craft really the greatest good?" "Of course, Socrates," I suppose he'd say, "seeing that its product is health, what greater good for mankind is there than health?" And suppose that next in his turn the trainer said, "I too would be amazed, Socrates, if Gorgias could present you with a greater good derived from his craft than the one I could provide from mine." I'd ask this man too, "What are you, sir, and what's your product?" "I'm a physical trainer," he'd say, "and my product is making people physically good-looking and strong." And following the trainer, the financial expert would say, I'm sure with an air of considerable scorn for all, "Do consider, Socrates, whether you know of any good, Gorgias's or anyone else's, that's a greater good than wealth." We'd say to him, "Really? Is that what you produce?" He'd say, "Yes." "As what?" "As a financial expert." "Well," we'll say, "is wealth, in your judgment, the greatest good for people?" "Of course," he'll say. "Ah, but Gorgias here disputes that. He claims that his craft is the source of a good that's greater than yours," we'd say. And it's obvious that what question he'd ask next. "And what is this good, please? Let Gorgias answer me that." So come on, Gorgias, consider yourself questioned by both these men and myself, and give us your answer. What is this thing that you claim is the greatest good for mankind, a thing you claim to be a producer of? The thing that is in actual fact the greatest good, Socrates, it is the source of freedom for mankind itself, and at the same time it is for each person the source of rule over others in one's own city. And what is this thing you're referring to? I'm referring to the ability to persuade by speeches, judges in a law court, counselors in a council meeting, and assemblymen in an assembly, or in any other political gathering that might take place. In point of fact, with this ability, you'll have the doctor for your slave, and the physical trainer too. And as for this financial expert of yours, he'll turn out to be making more money for somebody else instead of himself. For you, in fact, if you've got the ability to speak and to persuade the crowds. Now I think you've come closest to making clear what craft you take oratory to be, Gorgias. If I follow you at all, you're saying that oratory is a producer of persuasion. Its whole business comes to that, and that's the long and short of it. Or can you mention anything else oratory can do besides instilling persuasion in the souls of an audience? None at all, Socrates. I think you're defining it quite adequately. That is indeed the long and short of it. Listen then, Gorgias. You should know that I'm convinced I'm one of those people who, in a discussion with someone else, really wants to have knowledge of the subject the discussion's about. And I consider you one of them too. Well, what's the point, Socrates? Let me tell you now. You can know for sure that I don't know what this persuasion derived from oratory that you're talking about is, or what subject it's persuasion about, even though I do have my suspicions about which persuasion you mean, I suppose, and what it's about. I'll still ask you just the same what you say this persuasion produced by oratory is and what it's about. And why, when I have my suspicions, do I ask you and refrain from expressing them myself? It's not you I'm after. It's our discussion, to have it proceed in such a way as to make the thing we're talking about most clear to us. Consider, then, whether you think I'm being fair in resuming my questions to you. Suppose I were to ask you which of the painters Zeuxis is. If you told me that he's the one who paints pictures, wouldn't it be fair for me to ask, of what sorts of pictures is he the painter, and where? Yes, it would. And isn't the reason for this the fact that there are other painters, too, who paint many other pictures? Yes. But if no one besides Zeuxis were a painter, your answer would have been a good one. Of course. Come then and tell me about oratory. Do you think that oratory alone instills persuasion, or do other crafts do so too? This is the sort of thing I mean. Does a person who teaches some subject or other persuade people about what he's teaching, or not? He certainly does, Socrates. He persuades most of all. Let's talk once more about the same crafts we were talking about just now. Doesn't arithmetic, or the arithmetician, teach us everything that pertains to number? Yes, he does. And he also persuades? Yes. So arithmetic is also a producer of persuasion. Apparently. Now, if someone asks us what sort of persuasion it produces and what it's persuasion about, I suppose we'd answer him that it's the persuasion of teaching about the extent of even and odd, and we'll be able to show that all the other crafts we're just now talking about are producers of persuasion, as well as what the persuasion is and what it's about. Isn't that right? Yes. So oratory isn't the only producer of persuasion. That's true. In that case, since it's not the only one to produce this product, but other crafts do it too, we do right to repeat to our speaker the question we put next in the case of the painter. Of what sort of persuasion is oratory a craft, and what is its persuasion about? Or don't you think it's right to repeat that question? Yes, I do. Well then, Gorgias, since you think so too, please answer. The persuasion I mean, Socrates, is the kind that takes place in law courts and in those other large gatherings, as I was saying a moment ago, and it's concerned with those matters that are just and unjust. Yes, Gorgias, I suspected that this was the persuasion you meant, and that these are the matters it's persuasion about. But so you won't be surprised if in a moment I ask you again another question like this, about what seems to be clear, and yet I go on with my questioning. As I say, I'm asking questions so that we can conduct an orderly discussion. It's not you I'm after. It's to prevent our getting in the habit of second-guessing and snatching each other's statements away ahead of time. It's to allow you to work out your assumptions in any way you want to. Yes, I think that you're quite right to do this, Socrates. Come then, and let's examine this point. Is there something you call to have learned? There is. Very well, and also something you call to be convinced? Yes, there is. Now, do you think that to have learned and learning are the same as to be convinced and conviction, or different? I certainly suppose that they're different, Socrates. You suppose rightly. This is how you can tell. If someone asked you, is there such a thing as true and false conviction, Gorgias? You'd say, yes, I'm sure. Yes. Well now, is there such a thing as true and false knowledge? Not at all. So it's clear that they're not the same. That's true. But surely both those who have learned and those who are convinced have come to be persuaded. That's right. Would you like us then to posit two types of persuasion, one providing conviction without knowledge, the other providing knowledge? Yes, I would. Now, which type of persuasion does oratory produce in law courts and other gatherings concerning things that are just and unjust? The one that results in being convinced without knowing, or the one that results in knowing? It's obvious, surely, that it's the one that results in conviction. So evidently oratory is a producer of conviction persuasion, and not of teaching persuasion concerning what's just and unjust. Yes. And so an orator is not a teacher of law courts and other gatherings about things that are just and unjust either, but merely a persuader, for I don't suppose that he could teach such a large gathering about matters so important in a short time. No, he certainly couldn't. Well now, let's see what we're really saying about oratory, for mind you, even I myself can't get clear yet about what I'm saying. When the city holds a meeting to appoint doctors or shipbuilders or some other variety of craftsmen, that's surely not the time when the orator will give advice, is it? For obviously it's the most accomplished craftsman who should be appointed in each case. Nor will the orator be the one to give advice at a meeting that concerns the building of walls or the equipping of harbors or dockyards, but the master builders will be the ones. And when there is deliberation about the appointment of generals, or an arrangement of troops against the enemy, or an occupation of territory, it's not the orators, but the generals who will give advice then. What do you say about such cases, Gorgias? Since you yourself claim both to be an orator and to make others orators, we'll do well to find out from you what the characteristics of your craft. You must think of me now as eager to serve your interests, too. Perhaps there's actually someone inside who wants to become your pupil. I notice, in fact, a good many, and they may well be embarrassed to question you. So while you're being questioned by me, consider yourself being questioned by them as well. What will we get if we associate with you, Gorgias? What will we be able to advise the city on? Only about what's just and unjust, or also about the things Socrates was mentioning just now? Try to answer them. Well, Socrates, I'll try to reveal to you clearly everything oratory can accomplish. You yourself led the way nicely, for you do know, don't you, that these dockyards and walls of the Athenians and the equipping of the harbor came about through the advice of Themistocles, and in some cases through that of Pericles, but not through that of the craftsmen. That's what they said about Themistocles, Gorgias. I myself heard Pericles when he advised us on the middle wall. And whenever those craftsmen you were just now speaking of are appointed, Socrates, you see that the orators are the ones who give advice and whose views on these matters prevail. Yes, Gorgias, my amazement at that led me long ago to ask what it is that oratory can accomplish, for as I look at it, it seems to me to be something supernatural in scope. Oh yes, Socrates, if only you knew all of it, that it encompasses and subordinates to itself just about everything that can be accomplished. And I'll give you ample proof. Many a time I've gone with my brother or with other doctors to call on some sick person who refuses to take his medicine, or allow the doctor to perform surgery or cauterization on him. And when the doctor failed to persuade him, I succeeded, by means of no other craft than oratory. And I maintain, too, that if an orator and a doctor came to any city anywhere you like and had to compete in speaking in the assembly or some other gathering over which of them should be appointed doctor, the doctor wouldn't make any showing at all, but the one who had the ability to speak would be appointed if he so wished. And if he were to compete with any other craftsman whatever, the orator more than anyone else would persuade them that they should appoint him. For there isn't anything that the orator couldn't speak more persuasively about to a gathering than could any other craftsman whatever. That's how great the accomplishment of this craft is, and the sort of accomplishment it is. One should, however, use oratory like any other competitive skill, Socrates. In other cases, too, one ought not to use a competitive skill against any and everybody just because he has learned boxing, or boxing and wrestling combined, or fighting in armor, so as to make himself be superior to his friends as well as to his enemies. That's no reason to strike, stab, or kill one's own friends. Imagine someone who, after attending wrestling school, getting his body into good shape, and becoming a boxer, went on to strike his father and mother, or any other family member or friend. By Zeus, that's no reason to hate physical trainers and people who teach fighting and armor, and to exile them from their cities. For while these people imparted their skills to be used justly against enemies and wrongdoers, and in defense, not aggression, Their pupils perverted their strength and skill and misused them. So it's not their teachers who are wicked, nor is this a reason why the craft should be a cause of wickedness. The ones who misuse it are supposedly the wicked ones. And the same is true for oratory as well. The orator has the ability to speak against everyone on every subject, so as in gatherings to be more persuasive, in short, about anything he likes. But the fact that he has this ability to rob doctors or other craftsmen of their reputations doesn't give him any more of a reason to do it. He should use oratory justly, as he would any competitive skill. And I suppose that if a person who has become an orator goes on with this ability and this craft to commit wrongdoing, we shouldn't hate his teacher and exile him from our cities. For while the teacher imparted it to be used justly, the pupil is making the opposite use of it. So it's the misuser whom it's just to hate and exile or put to death, not the teacher. Gorgias, I take it that you, like me, have experienced many discussions, and that you've observed this sort of thing about them. It's not easy for the participants to define jointly what they're undertaking to discuss, and so, having learned from and taught each other, to conclude their session. Instead, if they're disputing some point, and one maintains that the other isn't right or isn't clear, they get irritated, each thinking the other is speaking out of spite. They become eager to win, instead of investigating the subject under discussion. In fact, in the end, some have a most shameful parting of the ways, abuse heaped upon them, having given and gotten to hear such things that make even the bystanders upset with themselves for having thought it worthwhile to come to listen to such people. What's my point in saying this? It's that I think you're now saying things that aren't very consistent or compatible with what you were first saying about oratory. So I'm afraid to pursue my examination of you, for fear that you should take me to be speaking with eagerness to win against you, rather than to have our subject become clear. For my part, I'd be pleased to continue questioning you if you're the same kind of man I am, otherwise I would drop it. And what kind of man am I? One of those who would be pleased to be refuted if I say anything untrue, and who would be pleased to refute anyone who says anything untrue. One who, however, wouldn't be any less pleased to be refuted than to refute. For I count being refuted a greater good, insofar as it is a greater good to be rid of the greatest evil from oneself than to rid someone else of it. I don't suppose that any evil for a man is as great as false belief about the things we're discussing right now. So if you say you're this kind of man too, let's continue the discussion. But if you think we should drop it, let's be done with it and break it off. Oh yes, Socrates, I say that I myself, too, am the sort of person you describe. Still, perhaps we should keep in mind the people who are present here, too. For quite a while ago now, even before you came, I gave them a long presentation, and perhaps we'll stretch things out too long if we continue the discussion. We should think about them, too, so as not to keep any of them who want to do something else. You yourselves hear the commotion these men are making, Gorgias and Socrates. They want to hear anything you have to say, and as for myself, I hope I'll never be so busy that I'd forego discussions such as this, conducted in the way this one is, because I find it more practical to do something else. By the gods, Chaerephon, as a matter of fact, I, too, though I've been present at many a discussion before now, don't know if I've ever been so pleased as I am at the moment. So if you're willing to discuss, even if it's all day long, you'll be gratifying me. For my part, there's nothing stopping me, Callicles, as long as Gorgias is willing. It'll be to my shame ever after, Socrates, if I weren't willing, when I myself have made the claim that anyone may ask me anything he wants. All right, if it suits these people, carry on with the discussion and ask what you want. Well then, Gorgias, let me tell you what surprises me in the things you've said. It may be that what you said was correct, and that I'm not taking your meaning correctly. Do you say that you're able to make an orator out of anyone who wants to study with you? Yes, so that he'll be persuasive in a gathering about all subjects, not by teaching, but by persuading. Yes, that's right. You were saying just now, mind you, that the orator will be more persuasive even about health than a doctor is. Yes, I was, more persuasive in a gathering anyhow. And doesn't in a gathering just mean among those who don't have knowledge? For among those who do have it, I don't suppose that he'll be more persuasive than the doctor. That's true. Now, if he'll be more persuasive than a doctor, doesn't he prove to be more persuasive than the one who has knowledge? Yes, that's right. Even though he's not a doctor, right? Yes. And a non-doctor, I take it, lacks expertise in the things a doctor's an expert in. That's obvious. So when an orator is more persuasive than a doctor, a non-knower will be more persuasive than a knower among non-knowers. Isn't that exactly what follows? Yes, it is, at least in this case. The same is true about the orator and oratory relative to the other crafts too, then. Oratory doesn't need to have any knowledge of the state of their subject matters. It only needs to have discovered a persuasion device in order to make itself appear to those who don't have knowledge that it knows more than those who actually do have it. Well, Socrates, aren't things made very easy when you come off no worse than the craftsman, even though you haven't learned any other craft but this one? Whether the orator does or does not come off worse than the others because of this being so, we'll examine in a moment if it has any bearing on our argument. For now, let's consider this point first. Is it the case that the orator is in the same position with respect to what's just and unjust, what's shameful and admirable, what's good and bad, as he is about what's healthy and about the subjects of the other crafts? Does he lack knowledge, that is, of what these are, of what is good or what is bad, of what is admirable or what is shameful, or just or unjust? Does he devise persuasion about them, so that even though he doesn't know, he seems, among those who don't know either, to know more than someone who actually does know? Or is it necessary for him to know, and must the prospective student of oratory already possess this expertise before coming to you? And if he doesn't, will you, the oratory teacher, not teach him any of these things when he comes to you, for that's not your job, and will you make him seem among most people to have knowledge of such things when in fact he doesn't have it, and to seem good when in fact he isn't? Or won't you be able to teach him oratory at all unless he knows the truth about these things to begin with? How do matters such as these stand, Gorgias? Yes, by Zeus, do give us your revelation, and tell us what oratory can accomplish, just as you just now said you would. Well, Socrates, I suppose that if he really doesn't have this knowledge, he'll learn these things from me as well. Hold it there. You're right to say so. If you make someone an orator, it's necessary for him to know what's just and what's unjust, either beforehand or by learning it from you afterwards. Yes, it is. Well, a man who has learned carpentry is a carpenter, isn't he? Yes. And isn't a man who has learned music a musician? Yes. And a man who has learned medicine a doctor? And isn't this so, too, by the same reasoning with the other crafts? Isn't a man who has learned a particular subject the sort of man his expertise makes him? Yes, he is. And by this line of reasoning, isn't a man who has learned what's just a just man, too? Yes, absolutely. And a just man does just things, I take it. Yes. Now, isn't an orator necessarily just, and doesn't a just man necessarily want to do just things? Apparently so. Therefore, an orator will never want to do what's unjust. No, apparently not. Do you remember saying a little earlier that we shouldn't complain against physical trainers or exile them from our cities if the boxer uses his boxing skill to do what's unjust, and that similarly, if an orator uses his oratorical skill unjustly, we shouldn't complain against his teacher or banish him from the city, but do so to the one who does what's unjust, the one who doesn't use his oratorical skill properly? Was that said or not? Yes, it was. But now it appears that this very man, the orator, would never have done what's unjust, doesn't it? Yes, it does. And at the beginning of our discussion, Gorgias, it was said that oratory would be concerned with speeches, not those about even and odd, but those about what's just and unjust, right? Yes. Well, at the time you said that, I took it that oratory would never be an unjust thing, since it always makes its speeches about justice. But when a little later you were saying that the orator could also use oratory unjustly, I was surprised and thought that your statements weren't consistent, and so I made that speech in which I said that if you, like me, think that being refuted is a profitable thing, it would be worthwhile to continue the discussion, but if you don't, to let it drop. But now, as we subsequently examine the question, You see for yourself, too, that it's agreed that, quite to the contrary, the orator is incapable of using oratory unjustly and of being willing to do what's unjust. By the dog, Gorgias, it'll take more than a short session to go through an adequate examination of how these matters stand. Really, Socrates, is what you're saying now about oratory what you actually think of it? Or do you really think, just because Gorgias was too ashamed not to concede your further claim, that the orator also knows what's just, what's admirable, and what's good, and that if he came to him without already having this knowledge to begin with, he said that he would teach him himself, and then from this admission maybe some inconsistency crept into his statements, just the thing that gives you delight? You're the one who leads him on to face such questions. Who do you think would deny that he himself knows what's just and would teach others? To lead your arguments to such an outcome is a sign of great rudeness. Most admirable Polus, it's not for nothing that we get ourselves companions and sons. It's so that when we ourselves have grown older and stumble, you younger men might be on hand to straighten our lives up again, both in what we do and what we say. And if Gorgias and I are stumbling now in what we say, well, you're on hand, straighten us up again. That's only right. And if you think we were wrong to agree on it, I'm certainly willing to retract any of our agreements you like, provided that you're careful about just one thing. What do you mean? That you curb your long style of speech, Polus, the style you tried using at first. Really, won't I be free to say as much as I like? You'd certainly be in a terrible way, my good friend, if, upon coming to Athens, where there's more freedom of speech than anywhere else in Greece, you alone should miss out on it here. But look at it the other way. If you spoke at length, and were unwilling to answer what you're asked, wouldn't I be in a terrible way if I'm not to have the freedom to stop listening to you and leave? But if you care at all about the discussion we've had and want to straighten it up, please retract whatever you think best, as I was saying just now. Take your turn in asking and being asked questions, the way Gorgias and I did, and subject me and yourself to refutation. You say, I take it, that you're an expert in the same craft as Gorgias is, or don't you? Yes, I do. And don't you also invite people to ask you each time whatever they like, because you believe you give expert answers? Certainly. So now, please do whichever of these you like, either ask questions or answer them. Very well, I shall. Tell me, Socrates, since you think Gorgias is confused about oratory, what do you say it is? Are you asking me what craft I say it is? Yes, I am. To tell you the truth, Polus, I don't think it's a craft at all. Well then, what do you think oratory is? In the treatise that I read recently, it's the thing that you say has produced craft. What do you mean? I mean a knack. So you think oratory's a knack? Yes, I do, unless you say it's something else. A knack for what? For producing a certain gratification and pleasure. Don't you think that oratory is an admirable thing, then, to be able to give gratification to people? Really, Polus, have you already discovered for me what I say it is, so that you go on to ask me next whether I don't think it's admirable? Haven't I discovered that you say it's a knack? Since you value gratification, would you like to gratify me in a small matter? Certainly. Ask me now what craft I think pastry baking is. All right, I will. What craft is pastry baking? It isn't one at all, Polus. Now say, what is it then? All right. It's a knack. Say, a knack for what? All right. For producing gratification and pleasure, Polus. So oratory is the same thing as pastry baking? Oh, no, not at all, although it is a part of the same practice. What practice do you mean? I'm afraid it may be rather crude to speak the truth. I hesitate to do so for Gorgias' sake, for fear that he may think I'm satirizing what he practices. I don't know whether this is the kind of oratory that Gorgias practices. In fact, in our discussion a while ago, we didn't get it all clear on just what he thinks it is. But what I call oratory is a part of some business that isn't admirable at all. Which one's that, Socrates? Say it, and don't spare my feelings. Well, Gorgias, I think there's a practice that's not craft-like, but one that a mind given to making hunches takes to, a mind that's bold and naturally clever at dealing with people. I call it flattery, basically. I think that this practice has many other parts as well, and pastry baking, too, is one of them. This part seems to be a craft, but in my account of it, it isn't a craft, but a knack and a routine. I call oratory a part of this, too, along with cosmetics and sophistry. These are 4 parts, and they are directed to 4 objects, so if Polus wants to discover them, let him do so. He hasn't discovered yet what sort of part of flattery I say oratory is. Instead, it's escaped him that I haven't answered that question yet, and so he goes on to ask whether I don't consider it to be admirable. And I won't answer him whether I think it's admirable or shameful until I first tell what it is. That wouldn't be right, Polus. If, however, you do want to discover this, ask me what sort of part of flattery I say oratory is. I shall. Tell me what sort of part it is. Would you understand my answer? By my reasoning, oratory is an image of a part of politics. Well, are you saying that it's something admirable or shameful? I'm saying that it's a shameful thing. I call bad things shameful, since I must answer you as though you already know what I mean. By Zeus, Socrates, I myself don't understand what you mean either. Reasonably enough, Gorgias, I'm not saying anything clear yet. This colt here is youthful and impulsive. Never mind him. Please tell me what you mean by saying that oratory is an image of a part of politics. All right, I'll try to describe my view of oratory. If this isn't exactly what it actually is, Polus here will refute me. There is, I take it, something you call body and something you call soul. Yes, of course. And do you also think that there's a state of fitness for each of these? Yes, I do. Is there also an apparent state of fitness, one that isn't real? The sort of thing I mean is this. There are many people who appear to be physically fit, and unless one is a doctor or one of the fitness experts, one wouldn't readily notice that they're not fit. That's true. I'm saying that this sort of thing exists in the case of both the body and the soul, a thing that makes the body and the soul seem fit when in fact they aren't any the more so. That's so. Come then, and I'll show you more clearly what I'm saying if I can. I'm saying that of this pair of subjects there are 2 crafts. The one for the soul I call politics. The one for the body, though it is one, I can't give you a name for offhand, but while the care of the body is a single craft, I'm saying it has 2 parts, gymnastics and medicine. And in politics, the counterpart of gymnastics is legislation, and the part that corresponds to medicine is justice. Each member of these pairs has a feature in common with the other, medicine with gymnastics and justice with legislation, because they're concerned with the same thing. They do, however, differ in some way from each other. These, then, are the 4 parts, and they always provide care, in the one case for the body, and the other for the soul, with a view to what's best. Now, flattery takes notice of them, and, I won't say by knowing, but only by guessing, divides itself into 4, masks itself with each of the parts, and then pretends to be the characteristics of the masks. It takes no thought at all of whatever is best. With the lure of what's most pleasant at the moment, it sniffs out folly and hoodwinks it, so that it gives the impression of being most deserving. Pastry baking has put on the mask of medicine, and pretends to know the foods that are best for the body, so that if a pastry baker and a doctor had to compete in front of children, or in front of men just as foolish as children, to determine which of the 2, the doctor or the pastry baker, had expert knowledge in good food and bad, the doctor would die of starvation. I call this flattery, and I say that such a thing is shameful, Polus. It's you I'm saying this to, because it guesses at what's pleasant with no consideration for what's best. And I say that it isn't a craft, but a knack, because it has no account of the nature of whatever things it applies by which it applies them, so that it's unable to state the cause of each thing. And I refuse to call anything that lacks such an account a craft. If you have any quarrel with these claims, I'm willing to submit them for discussion. So, pastry baking, as I say, is the flattery that wears the mask of medicine. Cosmetics is the one that wears that of gymnastics in the same way. A mischievous, deceptive, disgraceful, and illiberal thing, one that perpetrates deception by means of shaping and coloring, smoothing out and dressing up, so as to make people assume an alien beauty and neglect their own, which comes through gymnastics. So that I won't make a long style speech, I'm willing to put it to you the way the geometers do, for perhaps you follow me now, that what cosmetics is to gymnastics, pastry baking is to medicine, or rather like this. What cosmetics is to gymnastics, sophistry is to legislation, and what pastry baking is to medicine, oratory is to justice. However, as I was saying, although these activities are naturally distinct in this way, yet because they are so close, sophists and orators tend to be mixed together as people who work in the same area and concern themselves with the same things. They don't know what to do with themselves, and other people don't know what to do with them. In fact, if the soul didn't govern the body, but the body governed itself, and if pastry baking and medicine weren't kept under observation and distinguished by the soul, but the body itself made judgments about them, making its estimates by reference to the gratification it receives, then the world, according to Anaxagoras, would prevail. Polus, my friend, you're familiar with these views. All things would be mixed together in the same place, and there would be no distinction between matters of medicine and health and matters of pastry baking. You've now heard what I say oratory is. It's the counterpart in the soul to pastry baking, its counterpart in the body. Perhaps I've done an absurd thing. I wouldn't let you make long speeches, and here I've just composed a lengthy one myself. I deserve to be forgiven, though, for when I made my statements short, you didn't understand and didn't know how to deal with the answers I gave you, but you needed a narration. So if I don't know how to deal with your answers either, you must spin out a speech too. But if I do, just let me deal with them. That's only fair. And if you now know how to deal with my answer, please deal with it.